to make the services attractive, to make them affordable. There's quite a lot of planning, there's quite a lot of engineering, implementation that goes into these things that we can't just relegate it to an ad hoc service that is provided by anyone who can afford a vehicle. There is regulation that should come with it as well from the policy and institutional side of these things. And so when you put all these things together, you understand that it actually requires all hands on deck from stakeholders at both the national, subnational, even at the community level.
Hello and welcome to Just Africa, the show where we explore the forces shaping the continent's progress and the challenges that often go unnoticed. Now, Africa's cities are expanding at a pace unmatched by infrastructure development, with over 70% of urban growth happening in the informal settlement. Yet, transport systems remain inefficient, poorly connected, and dependent on imported models that rarely suit local realities. From endless traffic in Lagos to fragmented bus network in Nairobi and Accra, and the continent faces the mobility crisis that stifles productivity, deepens inequality, and accelerates environmental degradation. This is Just Africa, reaching you live from our studios in Lagos. I am Olumide Shokoya. I also have the ever gentleman, Onyepriye Kumale.
Hello,
So glad to have you. Hello, Priye.
Hi. Okay, so we are talking about building smart cities, cities that can put us on the same pedestal with what is obtainable in the more developed climes.
Yes.
When we talk about the more developed climes, I seem
Europe.
much more envious. Europe, yes, but I seem much more envious of China. That has both the technology and the wherewithal to build not only skyscrapers but also build highways in the air,
bullet trains,
you just name it. So, but what we are delving towards is to, most of the time when we start talking about even building road infrastructure and building some very, very high-techy skyscrapers, if you go to Eco Atlantic or you go to most African capitals in different African countries, you see that it is scarce, except probably our guest, since he's been joining us from South Africa, will tend to look at the South African space to see how scarce it is for us to have local organization engaged in the design, in the fabrication, and also in the deployment and use of local crude technology that was developed for that purpose. So even though we have multinationals who are building our roads, who are building our skyscrapers, who are building some of our government facilities and infrastructure, we must have learned from them by way of their collaboration with some of our domestic organizations or companies. Then there would have been a transfer of technology in the course of that, then domesticating that technology and using it to suit our local realities, because it burdens me when we have to still give most of these contracts out to multinationals and to other organizations who are not domiciled. Even though they are domiciled, they are not local, they are not domestic. So when we have things like that, the loss of money, because we don't retain that finances by way of the budget. It's taken out. The capital flight is humongous. And if Africa, with regards to the 2060 or the 2063, I think it's the 2060 Africa agenda, if we are to follow that, then we need to start thinking, domesticating some of the technologies that we've got, and within this specific case, building cities. Because when we talk about building cities, whenever it is the rainy season, it's not a palatable story.
Well, to be fair, other countries are having their own fair share of floods, hurricanes, and the rest. I mean, Jamaica also. But one of the things I always ponder is the technology or the skill, like you say. First of all, we need to develop that skill. Do we really have it in Nigeria? Most of the time we bring
not in sufficient capacity.
Most of the time we bring in expatriates, and even the ones that have been trained here, somehow, maybe because of where they find themselves, situation, they tend to go outside the country, for greener pastures or to better themselves and their families, and they take jobs outside the country. So we don't really have them much here. So we really need to look at that also, human capital. When we talk about, infrastructure, basically, do have the human capital rather, to make sure that we can actually do this, not just, bringing people from China or the rest of them and saying, oh, come and do this.
China is building your railways. They build railways in
Yeah,
Nigeria, in Kenya. You just name another African country.
I think we need to move forward than that. Joining us to unpack this robust topic is Dr. Obiora Nnema, a senior lecturer on the Department of Civil Engineering, University of Cape Town. Now, Dr. Obiora Nnema is a transport system expert, a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. She brings extensive research and policy experience in sustainable mobility and engineering design, with insights from his work on transport simulation models and urban policy design. He will help us explore how to localize innovation, strengthen city governance, and expand access to safe, affordable, and efficient mobility. So glad to have you, Dr. Obiora Nnema.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone in the studio, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, Dr. Nnema, what defines the transport crisis in Africa's rapidly urbanizing city today, and how did we actually get here?
I'll start by saying that urbanization and the rapid urbanization in Africa is at the heart of the transport crisis. I think it's not helped by the poor or inadequate investment in transport infrastructure and transport systems across the continent. Basically, when there is an influx of people into urban centers, that comes with growing needs for travel and other aspects of life. In terms of transport, travel demand grows as with people moving into city centers. And so the government should be responsive, other institutional stakeholders should be responsive to understand the needs of the travel needs of the population and invest adequately, to supply the infrastructure and other systems that is required to address the mobility needs that come out of urbanization. By your question, I'd say that rapid urbanization is at the center of it, but very importantly, we have the case that we are not investing as much as we should rapidly enough to address this situation.
All right. So when you say we're not investing enough, is it Africa? Is it national, subnational, nation, states? Can you please elucidate more?
I think that transport is a social good. It's a need of everyone in society. So governments and institutions at the national and subnational level should absolutely invest in transport. There's a role for the national government to play. There's also a role for the state governments or the regional governments to play in addressing the specific transport needs of the society. And so the sector is often overlooked and left to the private sector, and what we then have is, given the fact that transport actually requires hefty investments, we then see the private sector providing ad hoc solutions, to transport. The fact being that the levels of investment required actually exceeds just me buying a vehicle and putting it on the road. There is a lot of planning that should go into planning or providing efficient transport services to make the services attractive, to make them affordable. There's quite a lot of planning, there's quite a lot of engineering implementation that goes into these things, that we can't just relegate it to an ad hoc service that is provided by anyone who can afford a vehicle. Okay, there is regulation that should come with it as well from the policy and institutional side of these things. And so when you put all these things together, you understand that it actually requires all hands on deck from stakeholders at both the national, subnational, even at the community level. We should all be contributing to the successful running or supply provision of transport services.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Nnema Obiora. First of all, I'm glad that you are a Nigerian lecturing in one of the advanced African economies in the world, South Africa, because notwithstanding the fact that South African economy is big, when we talk about industrialization and we talk about advanced nations to a certain level, notwithstanding the way we have been tagged third world countries. We know South Africa is not doing badly, but I need you to talk to us as a civil engineer. What do we think when we start talking about utilizing local ideas in planning cities that are competitive, that, have a nose for industrialization, even if we are not as industrialized as we think we are, but future-wise, we know where we are going to, the industrial drive. When we talk about planning these cities, what do you think the African leader should put into consideration and cause it to reflect in the way the landscape of these cities are planned and executed?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we must start to think from a policy point of view and an institutional point of view. Because creating an environment, an enabling environment for innovation to thrive is as important as innovation itself. Okay, so when we think about innovating or innovation that drives the growth of cities, I think it starts with us thinking, how can we create an environment that supports this innovation? Once that is addressed, then I believe that there is no shortage of innovation on the African continent. In cities across the continent, you find innovation that is being expressed by people, by companies, by entities, that try to solve problems around building the city. I think that to a large extent, the unregulated nature of our societies, of many of our cities, again, like I said, an ad hoc approach to almost everything makes it seem like we can't solve our problems. We can't build cities, competitive cities. We can't build cities that reflect, the future that we all know about, as you have rightly said. But I do think that we must think as leaders, as those who influence society, we must think on how we can create this enabling environment. If I'll speak to transport, which is my expertise, we look across different cities and we see elements of innovation happening across. Lagos being a prime example with the BRT lights that's in the city of Lagos. I think that is one case where in many forums where I attend these days, when I attend workshops and conferences, I see that case of the BRT in Lagos being used as an example of innovation. Innovation in the sense that we can actually implement a low-cost BRT system without having to invest as heavily as many other examples of bus rapid transit across the globe. That is quite resource intensive in terms of infrastructure provision and other requirements. In Lagos, a streamlined case of the BRT is implemented and it's found to be efficient. Of course, it has its issues, but it's a prime example of the case where, as Africans, we can sit and think through our problems and develop context-driven cases, context-driven solutions that prime us for these cities of the future, cities that ensure livability, cities that ensure that every member of society feels like their well-being is secured in the city, and so that's my perspective on this. An enabling environment must be created, be it economic, be it from other different perspectives, allowing this innovation to thrive, encouraging those who express this innovation, investing in skill acquisition, capacity building, and other aspects of our endeavor that will encourage innovation. Once that is done, once that environment is created, I believe African cities will be the better for it. There will be significant transformation in very little time.
Now, when my colleague was asking his second question or his first question, it made reference to subnational governments in the continent of Africa and how it has become their own responsibility to look at the economic landscape of their state to make sure that in their budgetary allocation, they tailor the allocation of funds to the building of cities. And we know that the Ministry of Infrastructure, Road, Ministry of Works, are saddled with the responsibility of doing this. And we have also seen that in Lagos, like you rightly referenced, and I am sure in Johannesburg, Cairo, and in Nairobi, you've seen that most of the cities that has a face for development and infrastructural development attract businesses, attract lots of population of people, attract, you just name it, even those are the prime destinations for multinationals. But apart from the central government, we don't see subnational government taking this initiative. What do you think is the challenge? Is it funds, or is it ideas and leadership that they lack at that level of governance?
Thank you. Another very good question. I think that at the subnational level, like you said, we must start to think of transport as a problem of society.
Okay.
We have always had this approach to transport where we just think of, we will supply buses. We never think of the layers of transport and how it affects the everyday life of citizens. Okay, if I can't get to my destination, it impacts me negatively. If I can't get to my next activity, it impacts me. It detracts from my productivity as a member of society, And if we look at it at the level of the population, then you see that there can be losses. Like you said, cities where these things are considered, cities where there is thought given to how these cities grow, what sort of infrastructure is provided, the livability of the city and all of that, they tend to attract tourism, they attract other economic opportunities that lead to a net benefit or a net growth of the society. And so at the level of the states must start to think, and regional governments must start to think that transport is also our responsibility. Investment must start to be made, and I'm talking about quality investment in improving transport, because transport has many other co-benefits that it brings to the state. We must put in place, like you said, faces or people who have at the heart of what they do this passion to grow the transport sector. And once there is that goal and that drive, we absolutely will be able to find the resources. And by that, I mean the human resources, the skills that is needed, to generate ideas that can improve our transport sector. It's not only about buses and congestion. It's not only about building roads. We must think about how efficiently our transport routes are run. Now, this is not a job for the national government. The national government is not going to plan your local transport services for you. Okay? Investment must be given to planning local transport services and tying these to economic indicators for the city. Once we see the economic benefits, and indeed other benefits, for instance, people, the citizens of the state having better access to their opportunities, if we start to prioritize these things, then we would absolutely see the need to plan better transport services. And need I say that the budget allocations of states, at least in the context of Nigeria, must start to reflect this need to grow our transport sector, because there's a lot of other benefits that accrues from it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Obiora. Let's look at the informal transport system. Now, in a country like Nigeria, for instance, we have the bus route transit, that's the BRT, we have the yellow bus, we have the white bus and the thereabout. And of course, we have the train also running through some certain routes. Now, but my question now is, informal transport operators, they dominate African mobility. How can they be formalized without losing their flexibility or livelihood?
I think that there has always been this thought about approach to what is known as the informal transport services, where governments always had this notion that we would someday scrap these services and replace them with shiny BRT services or rail services and things. But when it comes to Africa and the way we have set up our societies, you would find that the informal transport services play a very big role in moving people around daily. And so with this important role comes the need to formalize. For your question around formalization, rather than think of it as transforming them into formal systems, which indeed are not devoid of their problems when you explore different cities, global cities around the world. I think the approach should be what is being done right by these services, or what are the benefits and the positives of these services, what are their negatives, identifying ways then to eliminate or reduce, mitigate these negatives will strengthen the positives of our services. You talked about flexibility. That is one of the biggest strengths of the informal transport services. So can we retain this demand responsive approach to transport which they provide while mitigating issues of safety, vehicular standards and emissions, pollution that comes from these services? So formalizing the service, I dare say, would require stakeholders coming together, the stakeholders being the operators of these services, but also the institutional stakeholders to come together and agree. I think that has been the bane of this issue of formalization. Well, it has always been the case that the issue is approached from a place of distrust, where the operators consider that we are going to be taken out of business. And once that's the case, we put up a defensive approach. For the institutional and the regulatory bodies, they have all focused on we are going to scrap these services. If we tone down that approach and say, let's get together, sit together and identify how we can improve the services while not taking you out of business, rationalizing these services in such a way that we maximize their benefits and then provide more efficient, more affordable, as well as safe services. That's very key, very important. I believe that we would find somewhere in the middle between scrapping or rigid formalization and just allowing them run riots on our road. I think we would find something in the middle that actually works for our context. And it will be a win-win for our society because people will not lose jobs. Rather, the sector will grow and offer the best of both worlds, if you think of it that way. So we must think about informal services from a complementary, how they can complement our existing services. And if the stakeholders are willing to sit together, then I believe we can find a solution.
All right, so what role can African universities and research institutions play, in shaping data-driven transport?
The university will be considered a base for growing knowledge, for capacity building. And so the key role we can play as universities will be to engage in activities that inform the improvement of these services, that create ideas on how we can actually improve the transport sector across African cities, but not just retain them within the four walls of the university. We must then engage with society so that the insights we grow, the knowledge and capacity we build can be transferred, to the stakeholders, as it were, to the operators, regulators, to experts in the policy space. We must then transfer this knowledge. So the role of the universities would really be to grow knowledge and then to disseminate knowledge that helps us grow and improve our transport sectors.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Obiora, I was looking at a document that talked about, referenced some of the most developed, well-built cities in the continent of Africa. I know you already know them, but let me just quickly read them out, just a few of them. Some of the most developed cities in Africa include Johannesburg, Cape Town, Cairo, which is actually most times ranked highly for their economic activity, infrastructure, and development. You have Cairo in Egypt, Abuja in Nigeria, Nairobi in Kenya, Casablanca in Morocco, Durban in South Africa, Port Louis in Mauritius, and Kigali in Rwanda. I mean, those are good. Let me make this. Former President Muhammadu Buhari, in his administration, mooted an idea about movement within the continent of Africa, most especially through rail and through train. He talked about building one from Katsina in the northern part of Nigeria to Niger Republic. So the former president also of the African Development Bank, who is a Nigerian and a very, very certified industrialist and agriculturalist, Kinwumi, I think it's Kinwumi Additional, also talked about the the benefits that life hollow if the whole African continent, 54 countries coming to trade together and what we stand to gain. But without a formidable and well-structured transportation system that can navigate most African countries, even if it's just the West African region or the South African region, without this transportation system in place or road networks or infrastructure, we are not going to get anywhere with that agenda. Do you buy that assertion? And how can African countries, under the umbrella of the African Union, start this conversation and give it the conscious intention for us to actualize it?
Very much. Yes, I absolutely buy that argument or that position. I am fully in support of the idea that transport supports socio-economic growth. It supports integration. If we talk about trade, if we talk about regional integration, there's no way we can achieve that without efficient, well-run transport systems. And it is across different modes of transport. It is across rail, across the road-based transport as well, passenger transport, freight, and all of that. There must be a concerted effort to invest. If you think about it, infrastructure is one aspect of transport. And so in transport engineering, we focus on the provision of infrastructure, designing safe infrastructure, implementing projects or projects that bring these infrastructure to bear. But we must also think about the system side of it, where we then manage the use of these infrastructure, where we manage the economics around this infrastructure to ensure that it is operating at capacity and at the levels which will bring about economic growth. Like I have spoken to the strength of transport in allowing people get to their activities. If we thought about it from a trade perspective, we can't bring the goods from one country into the other without well-run, efficient transport infrastructure and systems. So I absolutely am of the opinion, I support that position, that transport is at the heart of it. Maritime transport, other modes of transport. There must be a concerted effort across the continent, not just within one country. If Nigeria fixes its transport systems and it has all this very good infrastructure, or the cities you have mentioned in South Africa, in Rwanda, and all of that, if those remain at the local to the countries or internal to the countries without projecting towards other countries and other regions, then we will not maximize the potential that we can from trade. Okay, so from that perspective, I totally agree that we must invest in transport to maximize the economic outcomes for the continent.
The reason, most times when we mention this issue, experts will tell you there are different reasons. There's lack of political will, the political differences, or the political leanings by African countries to their alliances in Europe could be part of the bottleneck or the challenges that will make them to have a concerted effort to develop transport infrastructure within the continent. In Europe, not all European countries are, all together, but there's transportation networks connecting different European countries and facilitate trade from one country to the other in Europe. And that is making Europe to develop. We had somebody who sat here, who was speaking to him, he's a Ghanaian, and he said he paid 1,500 naira for airfare just to transport himself via plane from Ghana to Nigeria, and that's more than 1.5 million naira. I mean, why? Okay, so what are the challenges that you think you've noticed that Africa countries cannot come to an agreement regarding collective infrastructure development? What's hindering them?
But where I've experienced the high fares of flying from Accra to Lagos as well, so it boggles the mind sometimes. I'll go at it this way. Of course, the airlines currently, in the way it is set up, there is need for profitability and things and all of that. I was having a conversation last week with an expert in one of the airlines, local airlines here, and they said to me that the profit and the demand sometimes it doesn't support, the reduction on these fares and things like that. But like I think that that is where the institutions and the governments must step in. It's time for us to define what our basic minimum should be. Like you mentioned the case of Europe. It's not, there is definitely not all European countries in the EU. There are countries, other countries that are independent of the EU. But the one thing you observe is visiting these countries, irrespective of what unions they belong to and things, there is a basic minimum to say infrastructure will be provided, adequate infrastructure, efficient infrastructure, it will be managed correctly. I think that we must come to that place where we say that the next time we see that a pothole on the road or gullies on our road, or large swaths of area of our land where people cannot access, people can't move their goods easily to, I think we must come to that place as Africa, as governments in Africa, where we say, no, this will not be our basic minimum. This will not be at the lowest bar we would have. Once we have that mindset, then we will start, it triggers this thing where we either start investing in infrastructure, where we start providing the infrastructure that is required, or we source the means, the collaborative efforts, the engagement with the international agencies and international funding agencies, source those funds and use those funds adequately and as planned. If we define this minimum where we say potholes will not exist, I think we can do it. It's the case where for now we devolve it to it's the responsibility of the national government, it's the responsibility of the state government. Allocations or budgetary allocations are not used as they should. We can do it. We don't need 40 years, 50 years to build one road. We see examples in China, in other parts of the world, where infrastructure is completed on time, within budget, So we must adopt adopt this approach that says we cannot carry on with the status quo. The status quo is we spend 10 years building one road, 20 years developing a train service. And at the end of the day, we commission one bit of it, one section of it, and the others are left to lie fallow. We cannot continue this way if we indeed want to achieve these lofty visions you have laid out of regional cooperation, maximization of trade and potential. So I challenge the stakeholders, institutional stakeholders, to say that our infrastructure can be better. We just need to use the resources right. We just need to have the right skills in the right places. Let's move away from the talk. We talk quite a bit. It's not about talking up the storm. Let us go about implementing these ideas, these great ideas that already exist. And I believe it will transform our infrastructure.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Nnema. So if I may ask you, I know you're in South Africa. Which city models do you think other African nations can emulate in terms of local transport infrastructure?
I think your colleague already pointed out some of the cities. I think...
in your own opinion.
Yeah, okay. So in my opinion, the minibus taxi system in South Africa can be, there are lessons that can be learned there from the point of view of setting a minimum bar in terms of vehicle quality. It's a challenge when I look at quite a number of African cities, Lagos being one of them, of the quality of vehicles that we have that we have providing services. Recently we had some visitors from Maputo in Mozambique, and they were stunned at the level or the quality of the buses with which informal services are provided in Cape Town. I think that is something we can learn from. But then looking at a case, the BRT I mentioned in Lagos, where you don't have to invest so much in segregating your lanes if you wanted to provide a BRT service. Just providing those low-cost barriers, but very effective, I think already saved quite a bit of costs. So I think that if you actually look and study the different transport services across different cities, there is something to learn from it. I'm not saying Cape Town or South Africa has all the solutions, or that the Lagos BRT has its solutions. There are always positives and negatives. But if you study every system, in Kenya, I know that they run their public transport, their informal services through cooperatives. So these sort of cooperatives also allow the owners or the operators to band together and have one voice in negotiating and getting some of the things, accessing some of addressing some of the needs that come up in the provision of these services. So my advice would be, study each service in different cities. There are unique features that can be borrowed and then imbibed to come up with what is an efficient transport service for Africa.
All right. So, what institutional reforms do you believe are necessary for simulation tools to be adopted at policy and planning levels?
I happen to have practiced in civil engineering, road construction, design and construction in Nigeria before I actually moved over to South Africa. It's the requirement that if you are going to construct a road, after tenders have been done and contracts awarded, it is the requirement that you must do an environmental impact assessment. Transport impact assessments must be done before we go about construction of roads, right? Of railway and provision of infrastructure. There have to be designs that are done and certified or signed off by qualified engineers. When it comes to the transport planning side of things, these studies must also be done. I've said it a few times in this interview that it's not just about putting a bus on the road. We must go out and estimate what the travel demand looks like. We must go out and forecast what will the growth of travel demand look like going into the future. Only then can we say we are planning for transport services. So from an institutional reform perspective and some of the things that must change, our ad hoc approach to transport services or service provision needs to change. And this is where planning and indeed some of the tools, the simulation tools and the simulation models, that is what they are for. They help us to understand at a micro level, at the planning stage, what some of these indices or what the demand for transport looks like going into the future. Only when we are able to quantify them, I admit they are not perfect, but they give us a good basis upon which planning can be done. We can't say that we've got 5 million people in a city, for instance, and we have no clue around how many trips are made daily, how many trips are made annually. So if you don't know these, what are you planning for? In the engineering side of things, it is because we know the length of the road. It's because we know what the terrain is. We know what the environmental impact of that infrastructure is. Then can we budget around it? Okay, so it's not about providing 100 CNG buses. How much demand will 100 CNG buses address? We must put proper planning structures in place. That is one key reform that needs to be done before we go about providing transport interventions. I think, that's my response to that. There's also, of course, issues around budgeting and issues around investments in the sector and how the sector is regulated. So there's all sorts of institutional reforms that needs to happen. But I say where it starts from is we start to look at transport from first we plan. before we build. First, we plan before we provide the services. What kind of service do we need to provide? What does it require from a resource point of view, from the point of view of technologies? What technologies do we require? For instance, to communicate our timetables to the people who will use it, to communicate the timetables to the trade, to the companies, that need these services to move their goods and services around. So there's a whole lot of things: technology, planning, the regulatory aspect is actually another very big one. All of these, I believe, require reform in one way or the other for us to get to this dream of moving people around in attractive services that are affordable, increasing accessibility within our cities, and improving in general the well-being of our citizens.
All right, lastly, another issue that normally happens, I think, here in Nigeria, maybe some other countries, is project completion, especially when it has to do with infrastructure, local transport. We see a situation whereby they launch a very huge, humongous, capital-extensive infrastructure, and maybe 2 years, 3 years down the drain, it's suspended or it's halted. How can we address this? Because another government would come in, and maybe he might pick up from there or not. He might start his own. So how do we, so that we don't just waste money, because this runs into different budgets?
So, I think that there is no shortage of suggestions and ideas on how we can how we can address what you are talking about. But I think at the end of the day, is there a will to do these things? We know that we cannot continue to plan for infrastructure by political timelines. Okay, it shouldn't be based on 4-year election cycles or 5 years in the countries, where their election cycles are 5 years. These things have to be drawn along policy lines that exceed or extend, political cycles. What we need will then be mechanisms to make it binding, that the next government will pick up from where the previous stops, that there is accountability around how the budgets, how the resources are deployed, that we ensure that, because another aspect is bringing in, for instance, a contractor who doesn't have the capacity, to deliver the project, and you end up with a failed project needing to go back to tendering after some time and all of that. There must be mechanisms for and checks and balances put in place to ensure that every stakeholder in the infrastructure life cycle contributes their quota, and where they cannot, they must be held accountable. If budgetary allocations are made, there must be mechanisms to say the resources are deployed as and when needed to ensure that we complete the projects. Like I mentioned, the contractors and engineers and other stakeholders. There must be these checks and balances in place. The leader and the government, that comes up with the idea of providing the infrastructure. Before we get there, we must think about what do we require to provide. Are we economically in a place where we can deliver this project? Do we have sufficient collaborations and funding networks to enable us get to the end of this project? What, by the way, is the total contribution of the infrastructure we are investing in? If we understand that this infrastructure is going to yield these benefits, do we then have the will and the resources to deliver them? So there's a lot of questions around this. There's a lot of ideas that have been put forward, very good ideas. I'm only reiterating some of these. At the end of the day, it boils down to, are we willing to do? Once we are willing to do, I believe change and transformation can happen very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obiora Nnema, for your insight, and thank you for joining us on Just Africa.
Thank you very much.